Before we get going, I was wondering if I just like to start off this way while we wait for people to jump in. Although Owen and Woke, they've been here a couple of times, so it could be good enough. Do you have any questions from our previous conversations that may have come up?
Myself personally, or just anybody?
Yeah, just yourself personally.
No, not really. I'm just enjoying the kind of ongoing flow of the conversation here, and just looking forward to continuing it. I think we've gone off on some interesting directions, and um, I'm obviously curious about why you chose a particular title for this particular session. I'm interested in kind of getting into that. So, but yeah, no real questions.
Okay, cool. Um, yeah, let's talk about the title. So the idea for today's talk was to talk. So I've been hearing that people are frustrated with the power that big tech companies hold. And big tech companies do appear to be monopolies when you look at their core businesses. And so I wanted to talk very briefly about my experience as a technologist for the last 12 years and how I would actually go about regulating big tech. And the reason why I find this an interesting discussion academically and what interacts with sense making and the information environment is that we get right to the core of what defines an information economy as opposed to an industrial economy. So I wanted to start there and yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead
so I
and
mean,
go.
I wanted to just kind of talk about my priors a bit. I mean, obviously, different people have different views on regulation. I definitely lean more libertarian. So, and what I witnessed is that obviously, I don't want big tech to be a biased mouthpiece of the government in any sense. And it's very clear that a lot of it is right now. So it's kind of interesting to asking the government to regulate big tech. Well, they already are. And that a lot of the kind of antitrust actions in the past, like towards Microsoft and some of them, not only went nowhere, but disrupted technology took care of the problem over time. Microsoft still exists, IBM still exists. It used to be the big, scary giant, and yeah, they still exist. They still make tons of money, but they're not, considered to be the big scary giants they once were in many ways. Not to say they don't still have a huge amount of power. But right now, the big scary giants are Google and its subsidiaries, and Twitter was one, but that seems to have changed now, not through actions of government. So that's my point of view going into this, and I really want to hear where you want to take this now.
Yeah, so I would contend that Apple and Google both hold a monopoly, a duopoly in the App Store, and the policies that they have enacted have been not good. And it's not just about charging too high, sort of like a VIG, like a flag rate or whatever, a stamp tax. It's also about the kinds of apps that they allow into the store and sort of what you can do. So, for example, I'm a Twitter Blue subscriber, and because I'm on iOS and I originally signed up through iOS rather than desktop, I have to pay $11 instead of $8. And I don't see how Apple should be getting $3 every month because I use Twitter. I already bought my phone for $1,000. So I think there's a set of people who are frustrated with Apple and Google because of that
Of course, this
area.
is something
When it
that's actually
comes,
gotten better in the past couple of years, is because Apple um, used to basically make it so you couldn't, if you charged for something on their phone, you couldn't even link to other ways of doing it, or you'd be in violation of the App Store terms of service, and they've gotten
yeah,
slapped down on
well,
that.
and
So at
that's
least
just
when
it,
I
right?
went and saw the option to sign up to the phone, I saw, oh, it's only $8 on the web, it's $11 on the phone, so I went to the web and signed up for it. So yeah, so people who do have more options now.
Yes, and why is that the case? Because the European Union has been threatening antitrust regulation against them. So I do think there's a place for government to regulate, and I agree that you and I disagree on this point, maybe in broad strokes. But I just wanted to talk specifically about it and talk about some of the other companies. So we have Google and Apple, and the monopoly is the App Store, right? And eventually, by the way, where this conversation of censorship on Twitter and social media goes is that it will be platform level censorship by Google and Apple. Just how they removed Parler from the App Store, and actually AWS removed it from their computing fabric as well. I do expect at some point that the institutions will lean on Apple and Google to remove apps. Like even my mom just told me she signed up for this app called Article, which is supposed to be this like bias free app where you read news, and it turns out that it's basically just a way to launder. Is this basically a credibility laundering application, right? So I definitely believe censorship is going to be very heavily a thing. And to your point, it's interesting. We talk about the government as its own entity, but I actually am starting to believe that the government is a geography. It's not actually an actor anymore. It's just a geography. And what do I mean by that? It's not that there is an inappropriate regulatory capture between Goldman Sachs and the US Treasury. It's that the US Treasury is a colony of Goldman Sachs. The FDA, the NIH, the CDC are colonies of the pharma companies. The Pentagon and the Defense Department, particularly their purchasing departments, are colonies of the weapons manufacturers.
You're obviously using some pretty strong language there, but I mean, obviously, we've heard that called regulatory capture. Are you distinguishing that in any way from what you're calling colonization?
Yes, I think the idea of regulatory capture is the wrong direction. So the idea is that the government is powerful, and so outside interests get control of the government and then use it to enrich themselves. And I think it's the opposite way. I think outside interests are powerful, and I think they launder their desires through the government itself, which is no longer the most powerful thing. Even though the government holds a monopoly on violence, there's sort of like an allyship between all of the different parts. But anyway, I wanted to talk specifically about big tech. And I want to talk about like Microsoft, which seems to be back into its monopolist position, specifically around the Office bundle and how they're able to leverage their ability to deliver new software like Teams to undercut startups like Slack and Zoom for on a zero marginal cost basis, right? So the big contention for the Slack people was that they came up with this program. It was growing really nicely. And then Microsoft said to everybody who had Office 365 subscriptions, we're going to give you Microsoft Teams for free so you don't actually install Slack. And so from a regulatory standpoint, you might look at this as like the way that you would talk about it from a commodity standpoint as dumping, but in a software context, right? And so now that Slack is no more, they were forced to be bought by Salesforce, or so goes the story. Now Microsoft is free to increase the price of the Office 365 bundle, which includes Microsoft Teams. And you could see that they did the same thing back in the 90s with Internet Explorer. And of course, you could say, oh, well, that didn't go anywhere because then Microsoft missed the entire mobile operating system. But you can make a very good argument that they're back as a monopolist with regards to delivering software to America's core businesses, right? Like more or less, if you are a core business of America, whether it's in commodities or manufacturing or energy, you buy all of your software through Microsoft, which is a monopolist position. So that's the case.
Well, the old saying goes, nobody ever got fired for buying Microsoft. So
that's right. And previous to that, as you mentioned or alluded to earlier, nobody ever gets fired for buying IBM. And to my mind, IBM has sort of figured out how to sell services to the government. So you could say the government is a colony of IBM, in that I don't even know what IBM does except for exist off of like weird contracts from the government. Yeah. But anyway, I wanted to point out that people have observed that Microsoft, Google, Apple, Facebook, and others seem to enjoy a monopolist position. And certainly from an innovation and development standpoint, they have outsourced their core innovation to the startup ecosystem and then acquire them. And so it's very difficult for you could say Salesforce operates this way as well. And of course, Cisco was the company that popularized this in the late 90s with their M&A strategy. Anyway, so I wanted to talk about, and so there's a lot of, especially calls on the right for regulating and breaking up these very large entities, specifically Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Microsoft. And I wanted to talk about a little bit about the history of antitrust and the intersection with the information economy, because I don't think that the metaphor of antitrust works in the information economy, and I'll get to that in just a second.
So just a little context from my own life, I mean, the biggest corporate breakup of all time, I think, was the breakup of Ma Bell of AT&T, which became the Baby Bells, and I think that was the 80s, and that's what ushered in the cell phone era. and was generally considered to be a very good thing. But then again, AT&T itself was originally a government-granted monopoly over causeways for telecommunications, and so it was certainly within the government's purview to draw that back when the time came. Whereas that's definitely a distinction between that, in my mind, and other companies that you can certainly impugn them for running things in very kind of unethical ways in certain ways, but you can't claim they were originally government monopolies. So anyway, go ahead.
No, I think it's actually a really interesting conversation. I think the topic for next week could be like Section 230, Title 2 of the FCC Act,
I'd love to talk
and
about Section
this
230. I think
idea
it's a great
of
topic.
Twitter as a communications channel like AT&T. I think there's a lot of good stuff there, and I got in a big fight on the internet with some pedants about Twitter and how it should be regulated. And basically, like, did the government violate the First Amendment with what we've learned in the Twitter files? I think there's actually an interesting space there to discuss and at least get the thoughts out. But I wanted to talk today about antitrust, and I agree with you that the Bell breakup in the '80s was really significant. And okay, so let's just lay it out. So how do you get a monopoly at like a very metaphorical level in an industrial economy? So industrial economies, they tend to become dominated by what are called supply side economies of scale. So there are going to be a bunch of stakeholders in the customer, company, citizen ecosystem that are going to be suppliers, right? So you can imagine a company like Walmart is doing business with a farmer to buy apples so they can list apples in their store, and that the more apples that Walmart is able to buy, the more of the fixed costs the farmer is able to distribute across the apple growing, and so they can reduce the cost of the apples, and thereby Walmart now has the cheapest apples of all the supermarkets in the city, and so more people shop there because they're interested in price. And what happens over time is that these economies of scale build into businesses that uh, are able to exercise their authority monopolistically. And sort of the reason why we came up with antitrust in the first place actually was a century before the AT&T breakup, or just almost, related to Standard Oil, which is basically that through a combination of refining capacity, transportation capacity, research and development capacity, and last mile delivery, Standard Oil had a complete vertical monopoly on the extraction, distribution, and sale of oil. And so the government came in and said, okay, let's break them up in such a manner. So we got Exxon and all these different companies that came from it. Exxon is sort of like the main company that still exists today, like you could call it Standard Oil.
Mm-hmm.
And they broke them up and they came up with this idea of antitrust. So fundamentally, antitrust, as it's written into the law, and I don't want to get into the specifics of it because I don't find it to be an interesting conversation, but it is about taking an economy of scale that's on the supply side and breaking it up, right? And the way to do that, that's most easily explained, is the Ma Bell breakup, where they basically took the geography of the United States, and given that, like in this case, it was a monopoly because you only want one set of phone lines everywhere, you don't want 10 sets. The government basically said, okay, the South is we're going to break up like this, the Northeast we're going to break up like that, the West we're going to break up like that, and the Central and Mountain we're going to break up. And so I think it was broken up into like
7 or 8,
half a dozen or so. Yeah, I think it was half a dozen or so entities, which then of course reconglomerated. So today we just have Deutsche Telekom, which is T-Mobile, Verizon, and AT&T in the United States, and everybody else is sort of like doesn't exist. They like exist virtually. They're not. It's kind of interesting actually how like they functionally recreated themselves. And AT&T kept the government contract, so they kind of exist because they serve the federal government and all the governments. And then Verizon actually, was the one that was the research and development side. But when people talk about big tech and they talk about breaking up big tech, they're like, well, we want to break up Google. And you're like, well, why? And you're like, well, because they have a monopoly on search, and so they control more than 90% of the search market. And wouldn't it be great if we could compete on search? And then you might say, well, we don't need to do that because you have things like Chat GPT, and that is going to change the calculus for search. So I think that is sort of your argument
Well,
about
so
why
ChatGPT, to be
governments.
fair, is nowhere near. I would say it is a disruptive technology, and disruptive technologies come from behind and then eat the lunch of the big existing players. But I mean, Bing has great search results comparable with Google's, but people choose to Google over Bing. So it's not like there's no contribution. There's no competition for Google. It's people are choosing Google for other
Right.
reasons that maybe have to do with comfort or first
Well,
mover or
so
whatever.
this
But it's not.
to
It's not a
me,
monopoly.
yeah. So I do believe it is a monopoly, and I worked in search. And what I think is really interesting about what you just said is that it's not a supply side economy of scale monopoly, because people don't choose Google because it's cheaper than Bing. Whereas if you were to look at the monopolies that occur under an industrial society, the reason why initially customers chose them is because they were the less expensive option. And then over time, they outcompeted everybody else. And so they were not, in fact, uh, there was no semblance of choice. And in the case of Google and Apple and Facebook and all the other tech companies, what they have figured out how to do is to be a monopoly in their core business line, and then they have examples of other companies that are not in their core business line that basically don't make any money, right? So like Bing is a great example of a business that is just it's kind of like Microsoft is doing it because they need to have coverage, but no one is taking it seriously commercially. Like when you talk about Microsoft, it's not, Bing is not very, the contribution margin is not, it's relevant, but it's not
Well, I guess I
it's
have to
not
ask
relevant.
then, what does that actually have to do with, Google being a monopoly? Because, even if you can say it has, unprofitable competition or competition that, is basically maybe a loss leader for other things, it's still competition. How are you defining competition in such a way that you say that you can say Google is a monopoly?
I mean, I think Google is a monopoly because they use their market position to basically make it so that other search engines don't emerge. There's basically no other search engine at Google's scale, and it's not like Google's search engine is better today than it was in say
Fair
2008,
enough. But I mean, but there's
right?
also, I mean,
And
I
if the
use DuckDuckGo for
technology,
at least half of my searches, if not more, at this point.
yeah, but DuckDuckGo is not a real search engine. It's the boss, so it's a Bing like flow of results that then gets put into a database. See, I know where all the bodies are buried because I remember when DuckDuckGo
Yep.
set up. First of all, it's a honeypot, so it's not anonymized, but whatever. We don't need to get into that. But second of all, the actual search results is not from a multi-petabyte index and crawler that the DuckDuckGo team is operating. It's actually just like an API call to Google or to Bing, and they just sort of store the results and then do some human curation on the front end of it. So I'm consistent in this for people that have known me. I do not recommend that you use
Hmm.
DuckDuckGo. I recommend that people use Google, and I understand that like that's sort of fraught because Google is a monopoly. Anyway,
Yeah, I always use
but I
Startpage,
want to
which
talk
is
about
also a
how.
veneer on top of Google. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, to my point about Google has a monopoly on search, and why is that, and how do they do it? Well, it's basically um, the reason why a company in an industrial economy, which is defined by supply side economics, they get an economy of scale, and then they are able to create a monopoly there. And we have a regulatory framework that allows us to break up those companies. It's basically like make the commodities slightly more expensive and geographically disparate, or basically like break them up in the supply chain. But you can't do that with Google, right? Because to Wolf's point, it appears that they have competition in the form of Bing, in the form of DuckDuckGo, in the form of the Brave browser, et cetera, et cetera. When you sort of peel it back and realize that they're making billions of dollars in transfer payments to all the major companies for Google search. So Mozilla, they basically have to pay. Opera, they basically have to pay. Apple, they have to pay. I think there's some talk that they actually pay Microsoft as well, but I haven't actually seen the evidence for that. But basically, they're having to pay all of these entities to basically say like, oh, we're not actually a monopoly because technically we don't meet the definition of a monopoly, as our lawyers have architected the definition of a monopoly to mean, which sort of gets us back into the 230 point. But what I wanted to talk about is that in an information economy, the economies of scale are on the demand side, right? So an example of a demand side economy of scale is a network effect. And this is, again, where the conversation around 230 and Title II is interesting, because network effects, you could loosely say, are defined by Metcalfe's law. And Metcalfe was an engineer who worked at AT&T, and he observed that the value of a network was basically, what is it called? Algorithmically related to the number of people in that network. So I think it's 2 to the n is the formulation of Metcalfe's law. Somebody can look it up on Wikipedia if they care, but it doesn't really matter. It just basically means that there is a formula that defines the value of a network. And as more people use that network, it becomes more valuable, to the point where it's not economically feasible to start a new network, right? And that is the case with Google search. That is the case with Facebook. That is the case with Twitter. That's the case with Reddit. These are all companies that have strong enough network effects, demand side economies of scale, that they're a de facto monopoly in their environment.
By the way, just
right?
for the record, Metcalfe's law states that the value of a telecommunications network is proportional to the square of the number of connected users of the system, because every user is connected with every other user in that sense. So that's the square of the users.
Okay, the square of the user. I knew it was like an expanding polynomial. I just couldn't remember which one is the one that's like 2 to the n, or you know what I mean? There's like one of them that
n squared in terms of value, supposedly.
N squared, yeah. And there's like another one that's like n squared over n log n. Like, it's just there's a bunch of these formulations, but suffice it to say, like, in a network where humans are communicating, the value of that network grows exponentially according to a formula, depending on the kind of network it is. And in this case, Metcalfe's law is n squared. And that's the value of it, right? And so then the question becomes, well, how do we deal with a demand side economy of scale business like Google, like Facebook, like Amazon? Because you can't go in and be like, okay, we're going to like break Google search up into 5 entities, and then they're all going to compete. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, I mean, how do you break Amazon Web Services up? It's very integrated and and very monolithic in that sense, even though it's worldwide and everybody uses it.
Exactly, right? And so this is the question: is how do we actually break up the big tech companies that all benefit from demand side economies of scale, not supply side economies of scale? And so I've been having this conversation at a conference that Wolf and I go to with people from the FCC and the FTC and the government for going on 10 years now. And I am very, very interested in this conversation because, on the one hand, I don't want the situation that we have in Silicon Valley, the resting investing situation that's made fun of in the television show Silicon Valley. But functionally, what Google does is they take all of the money that they make from search, and some small portion of it they pay to a massive number of employees who would compete with them were they not to get ridiculously high salaries. And so you can make this argument that the last 10 years, like, I think it's something like there were 20,000 people at Google, and the joke was there's 500 people that do QA on search, and then 50 people that are actually developing search, and the other 19,500 just don't do anything productive, right? And then now I think they have like 150,000 people, and still not clear that they have anything productive outside of search, although they've tried with Verily and a whole bunch of other Google X projects, and then GCP and et cetera, et cetera. But really, it looks like it's the same thing. And there's tons of people that could compete with search because, like I mentioned, search today is not better than it was in 2008. And the way that technology works is that over time, it becomes cheaper and cheaper to re-digitize the process. And so you should be able to run like the original, you should be able to get a Google crawler, an index from like 2004 for very little money. Like, it should cost like $1 million at this point. And the idea that we don't see a bunch of search engines with this ridiculously valuable business model is sort of a head scratcher, right? And it has to do with, there's actually a lot of reasons that it has to do, and it has to do with what I'm going to talk about in a second, which is where Google's monopoly actually exists. There's the demand side, which you're not going to be able to break up, right? But there are some industrial supply side things that they focused on that you can make some changes on. And there's 4 areas that I want us to talk about. So before we get there, I wanted to ask Wolf if you had any questions, or if I'm making sense.
I think you're laying out a pretty interesting thesis. I'm not sure. I've been swayed to agree with the idea that that big tech needs to be broken up. But assuming arguendo you've made your case, I'm interested in hearing what your framework is for it, and how it avoids other externalities, which actually lead us in some ways in worse directions.
Oh, that's what I was going to say was the other externalities. So basically the idea is we cannot make Google and Facebook and all these companies less competitive because they are our block from having the Chinese come in and own the software development supply chain, right? So the Western civilization and Eastern civilization is kind of like in a major war right now, and we have been
Mm-hmm.
for 20 years. And if you've been on the internet, you understand that the Chinese have been waging a cyber war almost continuously for the last 10 years. And a big portion of that is to exploit the logistical choke points, which would be package managers like GitHub and NPM, et cetera, that have been picked up by major US companies that are affiliated with the Department of Defense. So when we talk about breaking up US companies, we don't want to make them less competitive because we do need them to continue to, for example, fund and keep Chinese speaking Chinese people out of open source, right? So the fact that open source is in English is like the saving grace for Western civilization right now from a cyber
Mm-hmm.
perspective. If all of a sudden programming languages were to work in Chinese and there was one part of the stack, like DNS is one part of the stack and there's a whole bunch of other parts, but if there was one part of the stack that was critical, that was only available in Chinese programming languages, we would be absolutely toast, right? And there's a lot of people that understand this, and that like whatever we do with regards to the big tech companies, we have to make sure to manage their relationship with the entire tech ecosystem properly so that like one of these big technology companies like Baidu doesn't come in and mess things up. So that is the externality that I am most concerned with, which is how do we maintain the American competitiveness in technology, which arguably is the engine of economic growth for the entire nation and the West in general, which is this sort of software eats the world thesis, while also making it so that there isn't a situation where the number one leader in search, arguably one of the most profitable and useful technologies of all time, is like only 20% as good as it was 10
Mm-hmm.
years ago. Which, if you've been on I mean, like, do you disagree with me that Google search was better in 2009? I think it was
I think it
phenomenally
was. I think
better
it
in
was definitely
2009.
less. I think they definitely have put their finger on the scale in various ways that makes the search less useful. Mostly in political correctness. I don't know how much about for example, dealing with China and so on. I know they give different search results depending on your IP address, basically, to kind of bias it that way. And certain things they don't report at all. Behind the China's Iron Curtain. But in fact, I think isn't Google banned in China at this point?
Yeah, they use
Baidu, yeah.
Baidu, but so the Chinese are not using Google search. That's not what's at issue here. It's the fact that like these tech companies are not just their primary business, right? So they're actually multi-billion-dollar data
Mm-hmm.
center businesses. They're multi-billion-dollar ISPs. So I bet you most people in the audience, haha, don't know that Google is one of the largest ISPs in the world, as is
Mm-hmm.
Amazon, as is Microsoft, as is everybody else. They're called autonomous systems. And you can go on somebody like a Hurricane Electric and look up their autonomous system number and then learn about layer two, layer three networking and then come to understand just how influential these companies are from a transit perspective, right? And that has nothing to do with
Right.
Google search, right? And then of course the fact that Google runs one of the largest DNS resolvers in the world with 8.8.8.8 is also another sort of like interesting thing, right? And I think for me, these four areas, so data centers, transit, enterprise licensing agreements, and open source, are the things that we should do with the big tech companies to make the ecosystem much more productive. And that is what my framework is. So if you buy the prior, and I actually agree with Wolf, I don't know that we should break up big tech, but I do know that the thumb on the scale with the political stuff in the United States, particularly, but I'm assuming the rest of the world as well, with regards to personalized web search in Google's case, so they don't actually show you results that might be real. So right now, the big sort of, I don't know what it's called, Orwellian term is, this search term is really controversial right now, or it's like it's changing a lot. So come back later, right? And it's like, what?
Oh, I mean,
What do you
I'll give
mean?
you one of the
It's like,
examples. I pointed this out to my brother, who actually worked at Google for many years on their click fraud department. But I pointed this out to him that if you go to Google Images right now and say search for say like white couple, all right, you're going to get images that have something white in them, but and you might get a couple white couples, but you'll get mixed race couples, you'll get all kinds of couples that don't conform to what would be a common notion of white. Now you could say Caucasian couple and you'll get something more like that, but you say black couple or Asian couple or whatever, and you get exactly what you would expect. So they've basically decoupled the term white from the concept of paler skin. Now, not to say that's the worst kind of example, but it's one of the most obvious examples I can think of. And same thing applies if you say white child or white. White is now a persona non grata term when it comes to that vernacular usage. Whiteness doesn't exist in Google Images search anymore, basically. And this is like, a very obvious and egregious example of them putting their finger on the scale. So I just want to kind of throw that out there.
That's actually crazy because it's kind of political, but it's not as political as the Pfizer story that they totally buried. Where
it's just very obvious.
Pfizer
It's very easy if you want to demonstrate to somebody that they have their finger on the scale. That's the easiest way I've discovered.
Yeah, so I think they have had their finger on the scale, right? And Facebook did sort of dip in a little bit inappropriately, in my opinion, to the 2020 election, et cetera. And so there is a growing group of people that do want to regulate these companies more severely, and they do want to, quote unquote, go after them for antitrust. And so I think if you are going to do that, rather than sort of crippling them in a way that makes them non-competitive, I think what we can do is address each of these four areas, and that's what I wanted to talk about.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay.
So now you're going to lay out your actual framework for the deregulation that you're hoping if we accept the priors, that it needs to be more strongly regulated or broken up, then this is how you would do it for the best results. Okay.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, exactly. And if anybody ever watches this video again, I would say that it's very critical, right? We say the devil is in the details and it's all devils. It's very critical that if you're writing this bill, that you write it very correctly. And I know that this is like a weird way to phrase it, but if you allow Google and its entities and Facebook and its entities, et cetera, to write this regulatory bill, you will actually not regulate these people. You'll actually enshrine their monopoly forever. And so you have to be like pretty careful with how you write it. And I'm happy to talk to any congressperson or otherwise who wants to talk about this, or the computer system that is tasked with doing this, right? So, 10 years from now, if you're doing a search on this and this framework comes up, okay, so let's talk about the four pillars. So the first pillar is the data centers. One of the areas that all of these companies exercise a monopoly is in their data centers. So, for example, Twitter operates dozens of points of presence, which is a kind of data center, all over the world. And as a result, if you're trying to make a alternative like a Getter or a Rumble or et cetera, because you're not in these data centers, you actually aren't going to be in these data centers because it's a limited amount of space and Twitter is already there. And so they're actually able to lean on the data center providers to make your experience worse. And it's very interesting because the physical infrastructure of the internet is physical. And I think a lot of people believe that there's sort of infinite capacity on the internet because they don't understand functionally how it works. But actually, it is a game of chess or risk, if you will, with regards to data center space, which is very expensive and hard to come by. And moreover, it's not just a matter of geography, it's also a matter of latency. So it's not just that you can physically build a data center in Virginia, it's that you actually need to connect in the right way to the backbone that flows through there in order to actually have a service where the quality level starts to approach a Twitter or a Google or a Facebook, right? And I think a lot of people don't understand this because if you go to the supermarket and you buy oranges and you are in Ohio and you get oranges from California, or you're in Ohio and you get oranges from Florida, the oranges can be right next to each other in the supermarket and be more or less, the same price if the transportation costs were regularly the same. That's not the case at scale for internet services, right? And so I don't actually believe right now it's possible for someone to compete with like Netflix or someone to compete with a YouTube or a Twitter or one of these companies because as they grow, they're actually going to be capped very quickly in terms of the actual data center space that they have access to. And so the first area that I would go to is I would disallow large tech companies, let's say with more than $1 billion a year in revenue, from owning and operating their own data centers. I would allow them to rent space, absolutely. They can do deals with private operators, et cetera, but I would not allow them to own and operate their own data centers because there's wonky things that they can do with the physical infrastructure to limit competition, and that is actually a antitrust monopoly position. So that was sort of like my first pillar is
So
the
let me
data
respond
center.
to that really quickly. I mean, it just seems to me that
Yeah,
obviously what you're saying is let's strike a blow against vertical integration. Of basically, being the farmer and owning the store that sells the meat, eggs, and vegetables. Um, so the main problem I have from my perspective is in a free economy, people get to vertically integrate, and vertical integration has happened in all kinds of industries. So, why is this industry special? Now, you don't have to respond to that right now, but that's just my first kind of reaction. I'd like you to continue with your points, unless you have something you want to say back there.
yeah. I mean, it's the same reason why AT&T didn't let people, develop third-party peripherals. They were
They
vertically
were.
integrated. They're basically able to leverage the monopoly granted to them by the government to vertically integrate, and then in such a manner so as to make it so that people
Sure. And
couldn't
as we stated earlier,
compete
that
with.
was also a government granted monopoly, whereas these other companies are not. But, so.
I understand, but to an extent, I'll make the argument here in a couple of pillars that this is a de facto government granted monopoly,
Okay.
which is why we do need to actually go in and
Fair
make
enough.
some changes. The second one relates to transit, which is very much a similar argument. Basically, there is a limited amount of infrastructure in the ground to transit
Fiber optic
data,
cables, things like that.
and exactly. And so functionally, it would be like if Google, it would be like if Walmart owned, elevated freeways with no traffic that were also paid for in part by the government.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And nobody else was able to use them.
Like if they
This is
had
like
lanes on the
functionally what
interstate that
has
just
happened.
belonged to Walmart, essentially.
Yeah. Or like a better interstate above
Mm-hmm.
the interstate. Right. And so there is a question of like, to what extent have these companies made themselves telecoms and therefore should be regulated by the FCC? And by the way, when the FCC was created, when all these laws were made for telecoms, they didn't conceive of the idea that a private entity could actually weasel into this monopoly, this government granted telecom monopoly, through market means. And that's functionally what Twitter, what Google, Facebook, with all of these companies that have their own autonomous system number, at a certain level, they are actually able to do this because of something, basically because of because of this idea of peering on the internet, which is about transiting information with like a best effort from point A to point B, maybe or maybe not over your own fiber optic cabling, right? And it's actually pretty technical concept, but functionally, what will happen is Google, as an autonomous system, will trade transit from point A to point B in their network for some transit from another autonomous system from point C to point D. And those off the books um, agreements to peer, because it's free transit,
Sounds
right?
like
And like
trading
from
carbon credits.
it is like trading carbon credits, except that it's for a physical infrastructure that includes an infrastructure that was built by
Mm-hmm.
the government for the use of
Mm-hmm.
everybody, right? And so, what you can do at scale is you can manipulate again the ability. So, like, how like earlier in the internet we would say that there was, if everybody watched the World Cup at the same time in 2016 online, it would like bend the
Mm-hmm.
internet, and like your experience of other websites would get worse. I don't know if people really notice this,
My
but this
wife tried to
happens
sign into a
when
live
there's.
BTS concert. They're a Korean pop band that's incredibly useful. They've been huge in America as well. And, she and millions of other fans basically brought down their network when they all signed up to pay to watch this live performance on the internet. So, yeah.
Yeah. So as much transit as we have, we actually are unable to build enough transit to keep up with demand just for video terrestrially. So this actually happened a few years ago where you'll remember in the 2000s, everybody installed all this like quote unquote dark fiber, and they pre-built infrastructure such that, we would have fiber forever. That's not the case today. today it's the case that there's so much demand for internet telecommunications that the process of digging up the ground and laying fiber is not fast enough. Like, you cannot build infrastructure quickly enough to meet the demand. And so the only thing that you can do is go into space, which is the whole like generating reason for the Starlink
Right. Well,
constellation.
also reach, just being
Uh,
able to reach areas that you could never really economically reach with fiber.
yeah, sort of.
I mean, I have friends who live on a
but like
mountaintop in
also like
Washington State, and there's no way fiber would ever reach there,
right.
but they have Starlink, so they're very happy.
Exactly. But like also at a societal scale, no one gives a crap about your friends in
Fair point.
Washington State. You know
Well, I
what I
mean, but
mean?
the idea of being,
Like,
the idea of the internet access being rather egalitarian, that certainly serves that purpose.
totally. And I'm a huge Starlink proponent. I think the monopoly that exists in tier one ISPs. So this is not, and by the way, this is a net neutrality issue as well, which is why you should 100% not legislate the transit pillar without actually really understanding
Mm-hmm.
what you're doing, because most people, when they think of net neutrality, they think of the last mile delivery, just like Comcast blows, and so they're going to
Also,
like
not
limit
not
the
packet
websites that
shaping
I
and
can
things like
use.
that. I mean, when I think of network neutrality.
Exactly. Well, you're a little bit more technically sophisticated than most people, obviously, but it's also what the tier one service providers do in the core of the internet, which is totally different, and they 100%.
Mike, you cut out.
If
Oh, this just for a couple seconds. Go back a sentence.
Oh, I was just going to say they definitely do shenanigans in the core of the internet where net neutrality doesn't actually mean what you think that it means. And you do want them to do quality of service,
Mm-hmm.
because at this point, like, POTS doesn't really exist. So, like, telephone calls are digitized and run over the core, and you
Just for the
want
other
them to have,
listeners, POTS is plain old telephone service, basically.
yeah. So, when you make a phone call on your mobile device, 20 years ago, you actually went over not the internet, right? Today you go over the internet. It's all the internet.
Right.
There's no
Everything is voice
difference.
over IP now.
Yes, everything is digitized packets that are using TCP/IP, just to be really
Mm-hmm.
clear,
Right.
right? And you could be like, well, technically, no. It's like inside of a TCP/IP packet, right?
Right.
And so you do want your tier one systems to prioritize telephony conversations over, say, like somebody's porn download, or
Sure.
even worse, their application patch download, right? It's like, I don't care if
Well,
my two
quality of service
gigabyte
then is a net neutrality issue, but it has to be made available on an egalitarian basis, and not just to monopolists or whoever happens to be in the hegemony at the moment.
Right. Well, and I mean, you can also say that like the specific application could be a monopolist. And this is again why I think it's very critical that if you are going to go and regulate transit, which you should 100% do, because the fact that Amazon and Google and all these companies operate these large transit networks, and it's what I'm not talking about Google like paying for fiber optic service from Cogen or EXO or AT&T or Comcast, the business divisions of those companies, not the consumer side.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is them using their free trading system. It's called peering,
Right.
in order to bend the ability of others to compete. And it's so technically sophisticated and so few people that know how to do it that there isn't really a hope for the government to play referee here. Like, it just you need to separate it out, which is basically like Google should not be permitted to run a telephony network.
So
And
go ahead. Well, finish your thought. I want to respond before we go into your third pillar.
no, I think that's just basically it. It's just like,
Okay.
if your primary business is not telecom, I don't believe that you should be permitted to run a ISP that engages in such large peering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean, I definitely understand your motivation for that recommendation. Again, I'm going to raise my concern before we move on. Not something we have to fully address at the point, which is that whenever you create regulatory pressure, you create some kind of incentive in the opposite direction. In this case, it seems to me the direction would be, basically finding ways around the regulation, either developing other kinds of communication methods, which would be a good thing. mesh networks or something like that. The things that basically maybe aren't economically viable right now, but become economically viable, but then also tend to play into the interests of the large companies that you're trying to control. So I'd be aware of other externalities, undesirable effects of actions like this, and would suggest that, again, maybe actually, disruptive technologies, actually do end up making a big difference in the long run. But anyway, go ahead.
I agree with you. And I think there's a space for setting down some guidelines.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them might be, hey, you can't also operate a telecom.
Sure. Well, I mean, obviously, I think you and I agree that Section 230 did a lot of good things and also some pretty bad things that need to be fixed. And,
Well, I don't think it did. So I think I don't want to get too much into the
well,
230
I'm just
argument.
alluding to a
Basically,
future conversation we should
230
have here.
Yeah, but I think it's important to signpost it here. So a lot of the intersection between tech as it exists today and the government infrastructure of policy, there's a mismatch in that some of the things, like 230 was originally part of the Communications
Yes.
Decency Act, and it was basically so that if I was to defame your business, Wolf, on AT&T's phone line, and the operator was able to hear it, that the operator and AT&T weren't liable for my defamation, right? So if I was literally on the phone with Joshua, who's in the audience, and I was saying, Wolf's business sucks, and somehow that came out, Wolf wasn't able to sue me and AT&T and the operator, which is like kind of an interesting framework to think about, because the idea that all of your conversations the operator was listening to is sort of like not even conceivable for us today, other than maybe if you think that the NSA is the operator.
Yep.
And so 230, which is all about this third-party liability, had nothing to do with, Twitter. And yet we are in a weird space where, because Twitter claims 230 immunity, so basically like they're not legally liable for their users distributing child porn, although I think there's specific carve-outs now that they do have an obligation to remove it, et cetera, et cetera. And there are actually whole classes.
I think manifestly illegal content has always been something that hasn't been protected by 230.
Well, so what I think is really interesting about 230 is that if I start swearing on the phone, is that manifestly illegal if we're the operator? Right. So then how is that other stuff not protected?
That's easy to answer when it comes to child porn. Child porn is created using people who cannot consent and are therefore being coerced, which is children.
Okay, but what about if it's like animated child porn?
That's a gray area as far as I'm concerned, and probably actually tends to be towards free speech. I'm a free speech, as close to an absolutist as you're going to meet, in that if it doesn't actually harm somebody to produce, it probably actually forms an outlet for baser instincts that would otherwise maybe express themselves by violence towards children. Same thing with violent video games. People are against violent video games. They think it promotes violence. The evidence shows otherwise. So we shouldn't be restricting violent video games, because that forms a good outlet for violent impulses that otherwise might be expressed through actual violence.
Okay. So now Wolf and I have just given a teaser for next week's conversation about 230. We're going to get back to regulating big tech, and I want to get into the third area of regulation, which is enterprise license agreements. So basically the idea here is there's a lot of shenanigans that companies can bury in their balance sheet and in their financial documents with regards to the agreements that they make with other companies. So for example, Google pays billions of dollars every year to Apple. And sort of what do they pay the money for is not super clear, right? And so you could think there was a court case where basically Google and Apple and others colluded to hold engineering salaries down. Like they actually met together and said, don't hire this person, don't hire that person, which is a big no-no.
That's clear.
And so the question, that's clear collusion. And so the question is, when they make these large multi-billion-dollar payments between each other, how do we know they're not, like, some portion of them is not, in some sense,
price fixing,
right? Right. It could be price fixing. So we don't know. And so the idea is that when these large multinationals engage in an enterprise licensing agreement together, much like how hedge funds have to disclose their position to the SEC every single quarter if they move into a stock, I believe that those enterprise licensing agreements should be made transparent, and it should be required that 90 days after they take place, there's a filing requirement. So if you have to file with the SEC regular financial disclosures, like if your officers are going to trade stock or anything like that, and there's a whole like class of people that do that, I believe that the actual text of your enterprise license agreement between entities that have that requirement should also be filed with the SEC and made publicly available. Because then what you can do is you can say, okay, this $4 billion a quarter payment between Google and Apple is actually covered in its entirety by the enterprise licensing agreements that we see. And there isn't any this and that that's going on, or at least there's more transparency to find that makes the this and that harder to hide.
Yeah, I mean, so
Basically.
I would say if you're going to get me to concede on any points when it comes to regulation or antitrust as a libertarian, I would say that it would be in the area of anti-collusion, anti-price fixing, anti-cartelization, things like that. Because and things like people in Congress being able to trade stocks based on knowledge of what they know they're going to be announcing and how it's going to affect the stocks. That's ridiculous, right there. So yeah, we need at least more
Exactly.
transparency
Right.
in these areas, and hopefully the transparency is enough. But also, yeah, if you're actually caught, colluding, price fixing, insider trading, then yeah, you should be punished too, because that is interfering with the free market.
Okay, great. I'm glad that we were after two pillars. The third one we're able
Some
to
common
find
ground,
more
sure.
common
Yeah.
ground on because I feel I also have a lot of libertarian tendencies towards this, but I also feel like there is okay, great. Over a 50-year time span, IBM gets slapped down, but in the meantime, it's like, we maybe have to go through decades of these people
Well, if you
being in
want to go to my
charge, right?
philosophical roots, I'm pretty much an anarcho-capitalist, a la Michael Malice, but that's really from a philosophical
Yeah.
first principles point of view. I accept we have the world we have, and we have government, and
Yeah.
then we're going to
Okay,
need to
great.
work in that
Good.
framework. So that is those are my priorities.
Okay. Okay, great. So to get back to the end user license, the enterprise license agreement, so not EULAs,
Right.
but ELAs. The other thing that happens is when you sell a bundle like Microsoft does, and I don't want this to be written to target Microsoft because I believe that other people, including Salesforce, do the same thing. When you have a bundle and you're a tech company, and you have a certain amount of resources, you do have the ability to copy market entrants like Slack or Zoom or whatever. And then you do have the ability to bundle them in, and then practice something like dumping, right? Which is this idea that you're going to pay below market rate for a product in order to make it so that the other person producing that product goes out of business or there's a forced sale. So in this case, you could say that potentially Microsoft and Salesforce, got together to enact a relationship on Microsoft's side, right? So Microsoft and Salesforce made an agreement that they won't compete in this one particular area. And Salesforce is like, fine, we'll do that, but we want to be able to buy Slack for an inexpensive price. And so Microsoft says, sure, fine, we'll develop Teams and then dump it. And then Slack is forced to get bought by Salesforce then at potentially a much lower multiple. And so this idea with the enterprise licensing agreements is that by making them transparent, then you can say, okay, of the $500 a month bundle, this many dollars goes to this service and that many dollars goes to that service. And so you're able to see, okay, Microsoft Teams is being offered for $0, whereas Slack, if you look in the public markets, is being offered for $20 a month. Is this an example of dumping? Whereas right now, to Wolf's point, the people who are in charge of actually determining this, because of the opaqueness of the ELAs, especially when there's really, really big ones, right? So IBM has like 200,000 employees, all of them buy software. So you can hide a lot of dumping inside of the ELA between Microsoft and IBM in that particular example. And so by making all those ELAs public, then you can ascribe in them the proportionality that is to each of the different business units for their bundling. And you can actually uncover if any of this, and that is going on. And the problem is so bad now in enterprise B2B software that in every single meeting, the conversation is, well, what are you going to do when Microsoft includes your breakout enterprise product in Microsoft Office bundle for free? Like that's a real conversation now. And so I think that's very anti-competitive behavior from Microsoft.
Okay, so we've covered 3 of your 4 pillars. We're going to probably go overtime a bit. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, it's fine with
Because
me.
I also would like to give other people a chance
So
to speak or ask questions as well, but I want to definitely make sure.
well, maybe we just do that and we just save the fourth pillar for some other time. Basically,
Well, if you want to
okay,
summarize it real
the
quickly,
issue is,
so we're not leaving you
yeah,
hanging.
it has to do with Yeah, it has to do with open source. So there is a relationship between the large tech companies and the open source in ecosystem that I don't believe is healthy. And I have a lot of reasons for that. But basically, there's a lot of technology exists because there's one random guy in Finland who's keeping the project up to date in GitHub. And so the way that donations are made into open source, I think is inappropriate. And so what I would say is that Google and Facebook and others are permitted to donate into open source, but there are two things that have to happen. Number one is the money has to be given into like a blind foundation that has a mandate in how it spends the money. And there's a requirement for people at that blind foundation where they're not able to go and work for the parent company that's giving the donation for a period of say 10 years before, like, after the money has been dispersed.
Wow, that seems incredibly. I don't know. I don't even know how that could possibly work logistically. I mean, I'm an open source author myself. I've open sourced dozens of my own libraries. I work for a nonprofit that does open source software. It's all very liberally licensed, unlike say GPL, which copyleft, which basically means that you can't basically use it for commercial purposes without striking a separate agreement. And sure, I wouldn't mind making more money if I had something really popular that people were using. But there's been established business models to show how that can be done. Things like Red Hat and other people who support these things.
I'm not, like I said, the devil's in the details, and I'm not trying to go after independent creators like yourself, Wolf, or open source. What I'm trying to do is, like, Facebook will create an internal tool that then they'll open source, and then they'll construct a basically a mechanism whereby they can chill out the rest of the market.
That's Microsoft's embrace and extend, strategy they've used for years. They'll embrace a standard or an open source thing, and then kind of tweak it to make it their own. And then kind of nudge people towards using their products based on those things.
So that was the whole thing that Adobe did with, I think it's called HDS, so, and HLS and MPEG Dash.
Yeah, and how's that going for them?
No, it's going great. Everybody's to pay fuck tons of licensing fees to Adobe. So like Apple made their own version, which is called HLS. The public open source version is called MPEG Dash, and then the Adobe flash drive version is, I think, it's called HDS. Anyway, cool. Well, so let's get some people up.
Anybody who'd like to speak, please request to be a speaker, and I'd be happy to hear your questions or comments for Michael or myself. Real quickly, I'm Wolf McNally. I created a piece of software called Flying Logic. You can discover it at flyinglogic.com. I also have the Beware of Wolf podcast on YouTube, youtube.com/@BewareOfWolf podcast, where my big thing is teaching people how to think better, not what to think, but how to think. And that's what this kind of conversations have been about. Michael, you want to talk about where you can be found?
Yes, I can be found at Michael Guimarin on Twitter. I am weeks away for the last 6 months, but weeks away now on delivering my first sort of sense-making guide that's very, very inexpensive and easy to get access to. It's going to be $27, I think, is going to be the product. It's freaking amazing. But just follow me on Twitter, and I'll private DM it to people who are following.
Excellent. So I'm not seeing anybody raising their hand yet, but
then we could just end the space, Wolf, unless you have a question.
I get to ask my questions along the way, so I think that we've had a really good exchange here. And I will be all these conversations. We've had, I think this is our fifth now, but fourth. Okay, fourth. So the first conversation that we had 3 weeks ago should actually appear today on my channel on YouTube, and the others will appear afterwards. There'll be, since we discussed such a wide range of topics, they'll be chapterized, so you'll have to kind of look over the range of subjects we talked and jump to what you're interested in. Michael has graciously granted his permission for me to do that, and so hopefully we'll get these conversations will hopefully in some ways be a little more evergreen than just the ephemeralness of a Twitter space.
I'm just trying to get them out, Wolf, so that the AI can learn from them later. So the Michael Guimarin AI golem that I give to my kids, or grandkids, they can be like, what did Grandpa have to say about this?
Honestly, my podcast is mostly aimed at my 18-year-old son. I have an 18 and 22-year-old son, and it's kind of aimed at them in terms of, teaching them, what their dad thought and how.
But he's not actually. he's not actually going to listen to it. That's my favorite thing, is he's going to get an AI to summarize it. And
well, my 18-year-old son, he's my video editor, so he has to listen to everything I do.
Oh, that's even better. Wow. That's like forcing your kids to like cook dinner.
I pay him to listen to stuff I do. So yeah.
That's what I'm saying. You're like, hey, you want to earn money? You're going to listen to me.
You're going to listen to your dad rant, and occasionally he'll chime in. I'll mention him in the podcast, and he'll put a little flag up saying, "Yeah, I hear you, Dad," on the screen. So yeah,
that's awesome.
So all right, well, given that we have no people who are itching to speak right now, I presume we've made everybody satisfied. Yeah, we're going to do this again next week at 1 p.m. Pacific time. We will be discussing specifically more things about like Section 230, because I think that's a super important thing. I think it needs reform, and I think that it's it's done some valuable things. It's also done some pretty terrible things as well.